What happens when a country spends years building friendships for the day war comes? And then that day arrives, and those friends quietly step back. That is the nightmare hanging over Iran right now. Because this is not only about American firepower, it is about whether Tehran has already been left to face the storm alone. Before we go further, do one quick thing for me. If you value sharp, clear analysis without the usual noise, hit like, subscribe, and share this video with the one friend who always wants the deeper story. The title sounds brutal, but that is exactly why this crisis matters. When people hear that China and Russia may not fully stand behind Iran in a direct showdown with the United States, the first reaction is emotional: betrayal, weakness, collapse. But geopolitics does not run on friendship, it runs on interest. And when the pressure becomes real, every country asks the same cold question. What do we gain? What do we risk? And what price are we willing to pay for someone else's war? That question is now sitting right on Iran's chest. For years, Iran has tried to build the image of a state that cannot be isolated. It built missiles. It built drones. It built underground facilities. It built proxy networks. It built relationships with Moscow and Beijing. It sold the world a message that if anyone ever tried to break Iran by force, the fight would never stay inside Iran's borders. The whole region would feel it. Oil would shake. Shipping would shake. Markets would shake. American bases would feel the heat. And Iran would not stand alone. That image was part deterrence, part reality, and part psychological warfare. It worked because it created uncertainty. If Washington struck Iran, how big would the response be? Would militias activate across the region? Would Israel be dragged deeper in? Would oil prices explode? Would the Strait of Hormuz become a battlefield? And most importantly, would Russia and China move from polite support to real support? That last question is where the illusion starts to crack. Because when you strip away the speeches, the photos, the summits, and the anti-Western slogans, Russia and China do not see Iran the way Iran sees them. Tehran sees strategic partnership, historical necessity, maybe even a form of civilizational alignment against American pressure. But Moscow and Beijing see something much more practical. They see a useful partner, a bargaining chip, a pressure point, an energy source, a regional disruptor. Helpful, yes. Important, yes. But not important enough to trigger a direct collision with the United States. And that changes everything. To understand whether Iran can survive the United States alone, we first need to define what survival even means. Does it mean preventing an American strike? Probably not. Does it mean winning a conventional war against the United States? Almost certainly not. Does it mean staying in the fight long enough to impose serious pain and avoid total collapse? That is a very different question, and the answer there is far more complicated. Because Iran is not weak, but it is also not protected. Let's start with the part many people miss. A direct U.S. war with Iran would not look like old fantasies of giant tank armies rolling across deserts. America does not need to invade Iran to hurt it badly. In fact, a full-ground invasion would be one of the least attractive options. Iran is huge. Its terrain is difficult. Its population is large. Its political system is hardened by decades of sanctions, pressure, and security paranoia. Occupying Iran would be a nightmare. Washington knows that. The more realistic danger for Tehran is something else. A punishing air and missile campaign designed to break specific parts of Iran's military machine: nuclear facilities, missile storage, drone production, air defense, command centers, fuel depots, radar networks, Revolutionary Guard infrastructure, ports, launch sites, communications. Not regime occupation, at least at the start. Regime paralysis. That matters because the United States is built for this kind of war. It has long-range bombers, carrier aviation, precision weapons, stealth platforms, electronic warfare, satellite surveillance, air refueling, regional bases, naval missile defense, deep logistics. And unlike Iran, it can fight while protecting distance. It does not need to mass 1 million troops on a border to create devastation. Iran knows this. That is why so much of its military logic is focused on survival through dispersion. Hide the launchers, harden the tunnels, move the assets, multiply the sites, use mountains, use decoys, use mobile systems. Build enough redundancy that an enemy can never be sure one wave of strikes is enough. That strategy is not foolish. It is the strategy of a country that understands it cannot match the United States plane for plane or ship for ship. So it tries to make itself hard to kill quickly. And that is the key phrase: hard to kill quickly. Because Iran does not need to be stronger than America to create a problem for America. It only needs to survive long enough to make the cost of attacking it feel dangerous, expensive, and politically ugly. This is where Iran's real strengths begin. First, geography. Iran is not a tiny state that can be smothered in a weekend. It is a large country with mountains, dispersed infrastructure, coastal access, underground facilities, and a military culture built around preparing for heavier enemies. Size does not make it invincible, but it makes rapid destruction much harder. Second, missiles and drones. Iran cannot dominate the skies against America, but it can fire at American positions, regional bases, ships, and partners. Even if many missiles and drones are intercepted, not all need to get through to create fear. A few successful strikes on airfields, fuel farms, ports, or exposed military assets can have real military and psychological impact. Third, asymmetric warfare. Fast boats, naval harassment, mines, cyber activity, proxy attacks, and deniable operations all allow Iran to fight below the level of clean conventional battle. Iran has spent years building tools for chaos, not just for set-piece war. Fourth, political endurance. This may be the hardest thing to measure, but it matters. Iran's leadership has survived sanctions, internal unrest, covert attacks, assassinations, and isolation. It is used to operating under siege. That does not mean it is immune to pressure. It means it is psychologically structured for long confrontation. Now here is the problem. All of those strengths become far less decisive if Iran truly has to face America alone. Why? Because Iran's entire deterrent model becomes weaker when its backers stop short of entering the fight. Take China first. China absolutely has reasons to keep Iran alive. Iran matters for energy. Iran matters for balancing American influence. Iran matters as part of a wider network of states that resist Western pressure. China has bought Iranian oil, helped give Tehran economic breathing space, and maintained a strategic relationship that signals political support. But there is a giant difference between helping Iran survive sanctions and helping Iran survive war. Sanctions are slow, war is direct, sanctions can be worked around, war forces decisions, and when those decisions arrive, Beijing becomes cautious very fast. China's top interest in the Gulf is not romantic solidarity. It is stability. It wants energy to keep moving. It wants trade routes open. It wants relationships not only with Iran, but also with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and other Gulf states. It wants to weaken U.S. dominance over time, not gamble on a sudden regional explosion that could wreck shipping, spike prices, damage Chinese industry, and force Beijing into a confrontation it did not choose. That is why Chinese support for Iran tends to live in carefully controlled zones. Oil purchases, diplomatic language, technology with dual use, quiet economic links. Maybe intelligence help, maybe political cover at the United Nations, but direct military backing in a US-Iran war? That is a completely different threshold. And China has shown again and again that it hates stepping over thresholds that could trap it in somebody else's crisis. Beijing is a long-game power. It likes leverage without entanglement, influence without ownership, pressure without uncontrolled escalation. Iran sometimes mistakes that for loyalty. It is not loyalty. It is risk management. So when people ask, will China save Iran? The answer is almost certainly no, in the way Tehran would actually need. China may condemn attacks. It may call for restraint. It may criticize American escalation. It may continue buying oil in indirect ways, if it can. It may even help Iran with information or economic channels. But is China going to put its Navy, Air Force, or national credibility on the line to stop the United States from hammering Iranian targets? That is extremely hard to believe, and the reason is simple. China does not need Iran enough to fight America over it. Now look at Russia. Russia's relationship with Iran is often described as deeper, tougher, and more openly anti-Western. In some ways, that is true. The two countries have cooperated militarily. They have shared interests in resisting American pressure. They have found common cause in conflict zones. Iran has also been useful to Russia in periods when Moscow needed partners outside the Western system. But again, usefulness is not the same as sacrifice. Russia has its own wars, its own pressures, its own economic limits, and its own priorities. It may benefit from America being distracted. It may enjoy higher energy prices. It may welcome a crisis that pulls Western attention away from other theaters. But those benefits are not the same thing as being willing to fight the United States directly for Iran. That is where many dramatic narratives fall apart. Russia can support Iran just enough to keep the relationship alive, while still avoiding the one thing that would truly matter to Tehran in a war: direct entry into the conflict. Maybe intelligence, maybe weapons knowledge, maybe technical advice, maybe public support, maybe joint exercises before the storm. But when the missiles start flying for real, Moscow has every reason to avoid turning Iran's emergency into Russia's emergency. And from the Kremlin's point of view, that is rational. Why trade Russian blood and escalation risk for a war that does not directly threaten Russian territory? Why risk a broader collision with Washington for a partner that is valuable but not central to Russian survival? That is the heart of this story. Iran may have partners, but it does not have bodyguards. If this breakdown is helping you see the game beneath the headlines, subscribe now, because the real story in geopolitics is usually hidden in what allies refuse to do, not what they promise to do. And once Iran realizes that, the battlefield changes before a single bomb falls. Because now Tehran must think alone. If America strikes, Iran cannot build its response on the fantasy that China or Russia will rush in and equalize the balance. It has to ask a harsher question. What can we do with what we already have, and how much pain can we cause before the pressure becomes unbearable? That leads us to the military reality. In a straight conventional contest, the United States would hold overwhelming advantages in air power, reconnaissance, long-range strike, command integration, and sustainment. America can detect more, reach farther, and coordinate faster. Its pilots train for complex operations. Its ships and aircraft work inside layered networks. Its intelligence picture is broader. Its ability to hit fixed targets with precision is far greater. Iran would not answer that by trying to mirror the US model. It would answer by trying to overload it. That means salvos. It means repeated waves. It means mixed attacks using drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, cyber disruption, maritime pressure, and proxy harassment. It means trying to turn the map into a stress test. Not necessarily to defeat America in one decisive blow, but to create enough uncertainty that US planners start asking whether every new phase of the operation is worth the risk. This is why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. For Iran, Hormuz is more than water. It is leverage. Around a fifth of global petroleum liquids consumption and more than a quarter of seaborne oil trade have been linked to flows through that choke point in recent years. A threat there is never just local. It immediately becomes global. Prices react. Shipping insurers react. Markets react. Governments react. Asian economies especially react. Iran knows this. Everyone knows this. So in theory, Tehran could try to use Hormuz as the ultimate pressure card. Mines, harassment, missile threats, drone threats, seizures, temporary disruption. Even limited interference would send shockwaves far beyond the Gulf. But here's the trap. Using Hormuz too aggressively would not only anger Washington, it would also hurt the very countries Iran hopes will keep helping it. China depends heavily on energy and trade connected to Gulf stability. Other Asian economies do too. Even states that dislike American dominance do not want Iran setting fire to a route that helps power their economies. So Iran's biggest economic weapon is also politically dangerous for Iran itself. That is what makes Tehran's position so hard. The tools that can raise the cost for the United States can also isolate Iran further from the outside powers it needs. The same problem appears with proxy warfare. Iran has spent decades building networks beyond its borders. Militias in Iraq, allies and armed partners across the region, long-range harassment options. The idea was simple. If Iran is hit, the response should come from many directions at once. And yes, that remains a serious threat. American bases in the region are not floating in empty space. They exist inside a hostile ecosystem where rockets, drones, sabotage, and militia operations can create danger even without a full conventional war. Regional partners can be pressured. Shipping can be threatened. Infrastructure can be targeted. But proxies are not magic. They can wound. They can distract. They can stretch defenses. They can create political pressure. What they usually cannot do is reverse the basic balance when the world's most powerful military is focused on a campaign. In fact, once the United States decides that a war has become existential enough, proxy strikes can backfire by widening the target list. The more fronts Iran activates, the more justification Washington has to intensify operations, not only inside Iran, but across the wider network supporting it. That brings us to the biggest misunderstanding in this whole debate. People often ask whether Iran can beat the United States. That is the wrong question. Iran does not need to beat the United States in the classic sense. It needs to survive the opening assault, preserve enough retaliatory capability, avoid internal breakdown, and convince Washington that continued escalation will cost more than the political objective is worth. That is a very different form of success, and it is the only form of success that is even remotely available. So can Iran do that? Possibly, but only under certain conditions. If the American objective is limited, for example, degrading nuclear infrastructure, hitting military assets, and restoring deterrence without regime change, then Iran may well survive in the literal sense. It may absorb the strikes, retaliate unevenly, declare victory domestically, rebuild over time, and continue existing as a battered but functioning state. But if the objective expands, if the campaign becomes prolonged, if command networks are shredded, if missile forces are steadily hunted, if air defenses are suppressed, if ports and energy infrastructure are repeatedly hit, if internal unrest grows, and if outside powers still refuse to intervene directly, then the meaning of survival becomes much darker. Because a country can survive on paper while losing much of its strategic freedom. That is the scenario Iran fears most. Not instant annihilation, slow suffocation under overwhelming pressure. And this is exactly why the role of China and Russia matters so much. Not because either one can magically win the war for Iran, but because their refusal to fully commit tells Tehran something terrifying. In the most dangerous moment, Iran may be strategically lonely. That loneliness affects morale. It affects risk tolerance. It affects bargaining power. It affects whether Iran escalates or holds back. And above all, it affects what happens before the war even starts. Because once Iran understands that no cavalry is coming, diplomacy starts to look different. Suddenly, negotiations are not just about pride. They become about preserving the system before it enters a fight it cannot control. Suddenly, every underground facility is not just a symbol of resistance. It is a question mark. Can it survive repeated strikes? Can it be repaired? Is it worth triggering a larger campaign? Suddenly, every missile stockpile is not just a deterrent. It is a timer. Fire too little, and Iran looks weak. Fire too much, and Iran invites a more brutal response. Suddenly, every proxy becomes both an asset and a liability. And suddenly, all the grand talk about blocks and partnerships starts to sound very thin. This is why the phrase "fed to the wolves" feels so harsh, but so powerful. It captures the emotional side of strategic abandonment. Not total betrayal in a legal sense. Not a formal break. Something colder. Something more realistic. A partner is left with statements, handshakes, and sympathy, while the real costs are left for that partner to carry alone. That is often how great power politics works. Not with dramatic betrayal on live television, but with careful distance at the moment sacrifice becomes expensive. Now, to be fair, Iran is not helpless. It can still make any U.S. operation painful. It can still threaten regional infrastructure. It can still reach bases. It can still use geography, concealment, and attrition. It can still unsettle markets. It can still endure longer than some people expect. Any war with Iran would be dangerous, messy, and full of consequences. But dangerous for America does not mean favorable for Iran. That distinction matters. An American strike package does not need perfection to impose massive damage. Iran, by contrast, needs a high level of strategic discipline just to avoid making a bad situation worse. One misread escalation, one strike that kills too many Americans, one serious disruption in global shipping, one activation of too many regional fronts. Any of those could push Washington toward a broader campaign. And in a broader campaign, the imbalance becomes harder and harder to manage. This is where the emotional core of the story lives. Iran built an entire security worldview around resistance. Endure the sanctions, endure the isolation, build the missiles, build the networks, wait out the West, survive long enough, and the balance will shift. Maybe America gets tired, maybe the region changes, maybe China rises. Maybe Russia helps create a new world where U.S. coercion no longer decides everything. But a direct crisis tests all of that at once. It asks whether resistance has created real security or only delayed vulnerability. It asks whether Iran's partnerships are battle-ready or just politically convenient. It asks whether deterrence still works when the other side believes your partners will not truly step in. And it asks the hardest question of all: when the myth burns away, what is left? Maybe what is left is still enough to survive. Iran is not a paper state. It has institutions, weapons, manpower, ideology, and experience under pressure. It would not simply vanish because American bombs fell. Anyone who thinks this would be easy is not taking Iran seriously. But surviving is not the same as standing tall. Iran could endure and still come out weaker, more exposed, more dependent, and more aware that the world it thought it had built is not as solid as it looked. That may be the true strategic defeat, even if the regime remains in place. And if you want more videos that cut through slogans and show you what power really looks like when the masks come off, like this video, subscribe, and send it to someone who still believes alliances are built on loyalty instead of leverage. So, can Iran survive the United States alone? If by survive you mean can Iran stop the United States from hitting it hard, the answer is probably no. If by survive you mean can Iran win a direct conventional war, the answer is almost certainly no. If by survive you mean can Iran absorb punishment, strike back, endure the shock, and remain standing as a state, then yes, it probably can for some time. But that answer should not comfort Tehran, because the deeper truth is this: Iran's real shield was never supposed to be just its missiles, its tunnels, or its proxies. Its real shield was uncertainty, the fear of regional chaos, the fear of economic shock, the fear that war with Iran would pull in too many actors and create too many consequences. If China and Russia signal that they will not go beyond limited support, that shield becomes thinner, not gone, but thinner. And once that shield thins, Iran is forced into a brutal choice: compromise and look weaker than it wants, escalate and risk devastation, or try to walk the knife edge between the two while hoping America blinks first. That is not a position of strength, that is a survival game. And survival games are cruel, because they do not reward pride. They reward patience, calculation, deception, and pain tolerance. Iran has those qualities. What it may not have is enough outside commitment to turn endurance into advantage. In the end, that is why this moment matters so much. Not because it proves Iran is weak, and not because it proves America can do anything without cost. It matters because it exposes the gap between partnership and protection. Russia and China may want Iran useful. They may want Iran defiant. They may want Iran alive. But wanting Iran alive is not the same as stepping in front of the bullets. And if that reality is finally sinking in inside Tehran, then the real crisis is even bigger than missiles and warships. It is the collapse of a belief. The belief that when the wolves came, Iran would not face them alone. That belief may be dying first. And if it does, then even before the first strike, Iran has already lost something huge. It has lost certainty. And in a confrontation like this, certainty may be the one thing a country cannot afford to lose.